joining us to discuss Michael Weintraub's paper. Jessie, if you would get us started, please.
Hi, everyone. Well, can you all hear me okay? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. All right. So I thought this was a really interesting paper. I really loved the idea of disaggregating beyond the armed group to get at the subgroup aspect. And I thought the surveys sounded really interesting, and I'd be interested in hearing more about those surveys that were used. What I did find a little unclear was the theory aspect of the paper. So I would be really interested in hearing a clarification of the theory and the theoretical mechanisms that you talked about and proposed, and also sort of setting out perhaps key hypotheses that you were hoping to test. So then, in terms of more specific points, so a key aspect of the paper is this argument that decisions regarding the choice of targets are conditioned in part by this normative acceptability of generating civilian casualties, which is connected, which derives from the ideological association, from what I understood of the paper. And so there's this big emphasis on the idea of normative acceptability throughout. And so I was curious about how the strategic costs of civilian casualties, such as bad press, civilian population turning against the insurgents, that type of thing, how that plays into it. And so there was page 6, for instance, mentioned sort of in passing that ideology helps define what is strategically desirable. But I didn't see any alternative explanations for strategic determination of interests, and research on terrorist groups definitely indicates that there are at least a few. So I was interested in hearing more about whether this assumption is that the desire to avoid civilian casualties is folded into this measure of ideology in terms of strategic goals, or whether that's negligible or unmeasurable in your opinion, or not worth attempting to measure. So another assertion that I picked up on, both in the abstract and throughout the paper, was that ideology substantively affects combatant behavior. But the mechanisms seem to be very focused on the mid-level commanders of the subunit groups. For instance, commanders use ideological instruction to transmit to foot soldiers these norms. And so I'm interested in hearing more about who's responsible for organizing the attacks, because the analysis looks at these different types of attacks. And so are the foot soldiers responsible for organizing the attacks, or do the mid-level commanders, are they the ones that organize and set up these attacks and how they should be carried out? And so if the mid-level commanders are the ones who are organizing and responsible for these attacks, I'm wondering about the emphasis throughout on combatant behavior overall if a smaller number of elites are the ones who are responsible for this. So I'm interested in hearing a little more about the hierarchy of authority. And then if you're interested in focusing on foot soldiers, should the dependent variable not be focused on so much the type of attack, but the civilian casualties that result from any type of attack, if the foot soldiers aren't the ones who are responsible? And then sort of a second question that follows from that for me was, are you actually trying to proxy mid-level commander ideology using surveys? And so, relatedly, were there any mid-level commanders included in this sample, and can they be sort of separated and evaluated independently in terms of their responses? Should I stop now and wait for a response, or should I keep going and finish up?
I defer to the chair.
I had to unmute my mic there. Why don't you go ahead and and continue, and Michael, you're taking notes if you need
Sure.
to. Are you good?
Yep, totally good. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. So a follow-up question then to this idea of measuring what I'm assuming are sort of generally people involved in combat, sort of perhaps more foot soldier types as opposed to mid-level commanders. If it's mid-level commander ideology which motivates or restrains violence against civilians, what about this implication for policymakers mentioned in the introduction about policymakers being able to extrapolate from individual ex-combatant level of ideology when diagnosing the likelihood of recidivism? So I was wondering about that. And then I had some specific data questions. And I was really interested in these surveys and how they were set up. And so I'm wondering what type of discourse was used to measure ideology. And do the surveys directly address aspects of ideology pertinent to civilian casualties or civilian focus in attacks? And how do you classify these discourses, these meta discourses overall, and as being pro or against violence against civilians? So I'm curious about the specific survey items, but then also, are you making the argument that the ideology, that FARC's ideology is anti-civilian violence? So I'm curious about that. And I'm also curious about selection bias of the participants, and this was in terms of people who responded to the survey. And this was mentioned in the paper, but I just wanted to go back to it briefly and consider the possibility of the survey participants potentially being less violent or less apt to express their how acceptable they thought a particular level of violence would be, given that these were the ones who were participating in a reintegration program, as opposed to perhaps combatants who were still hiding out somewhere or not participating in a reintegration program. And then finally, in terms of the regressions, I'm curious about if you thought about separating out dummies for the regions or the area. And if not, I'd just like to know briefly how the area variable was coded. And finally, how would you describe sort of a substantive interpretation of the regression results? And that's all I've got for now.
Okay, great. We'll turn it over to Michael. Thank you, Jessie. And I neglected to remind everybody, if you want at any time to put a new topic on the discussion, try to get one finger up in front of your camera and look for Christian to nod that he's got it. If you want to jump in on a current, get 2 fingers up and do that at any time. Okay? Michael.
Fantastic. Thanks, Will. Jessie, these are really fantastic comments. I'm super grateful, and I'm grateful to everyone for being here this morning and dedicating some time to this paper. This is in a very, very early stage, so I think you've hit on what I see as the principal weaknesses of the paper, and that has to do with really getting at mechanisms, figuring out whether what we're proxying with our surveys are actually capturing the level of analysis at which the theory operates. And so I don't necessarily have great answers for you on all of these points, but they're things that I think my co-author and I need to think more about. In terms of, let me see where I can actually come back and provide clear answers for you. So mid-level commanders are the ones who are organizing and who are responsible for target selection. And I think you're right to flag that most of our survey respondents are not those people. That is, they are the foot soldiers who are actually going out and doing the killing or doing the attacking of military posts or ambushes or whatever it may be. So there is some slippage there between the level at which our theory operates and the proxy variable in the survey. But the claim that we're trying to make is that commander preferences are being communicated in almost daily meetings and indoctrination sessions, reliably, we think, to combatants. And so if those preferences are actually being transmitted, then presumably their ideology is being transmitted to foot soldiers as well. So this is something that a lot more fleshing out in the paper, and you can tell me, in some ways you've already told me that you don't buy it, which is useful, and I'd be interested in hearing from others as to whether you buy it as well. Yeah, let's see. What else can I answer? So I don't think we're making the argument that all ideologies are anti-civilian or pro-civilian. I think we are making the argument in the specific Colombian case that many of the Bolivarian ideologies that are prominently communicated to foot soldiers by commanders in Colombia in the FARC stress the importance of civilian collaboration and of avoiding indiscriminate violence against civilians. So in this particular case anyway, I think that's a reasonable assumption to make. But in general, that's not a reasonable assumption to make. And part of, I think, the strength of the Gutierrez, Sanin, and Wood article, 2014 JPR, is to actually say that the content of ideology matters a whole lot. It's not just whether soldiers are somehow ideologically driven or not, which is, of course, what earlier work stressed. And I think we want to sort of continue in that vein. And we have more to go in terms of, I think, fleshing out what the Bolivarian ideology is. We need to do a better job of that in the paper. But in this case, I do think that it is broadly pro-civilian in the sense that it stresses the importance of not indiscriminately targeting civilians. In terms of selection bias about participants in the survey, yeah, this is always a problem when you're surveying ex-combatants. Because it's not a random sample of active combatants, so there's always a selection problem when you look at ex-combatants who have basically been tempted by the government into accepting their offer. And we have every reason to believe that those combatants are going to be different from those who are still in the field. But I think that within the subset of those who have demobilized and who have accepted the government's offer to demobilize, we can be more or less confident that that these are representative of the broader population of demobilized combatants. So it goes a couple steps towards addressing the selection problem, but not probably as far as you or I would like to go. I think I want to shut up because there are lots of really smart people, smarter than me, on this call, and I'd like to hear from you. And maybe we can circle back around, and I can address some of those other points later on. Is that okay?
Chris, you're muted. Chris, you're muted.
No, I can hear you, Chris.
So the queuing for the ones and the twos probably works best after the discussant has started off and after the first presenter discussion has gone, because intervening directly into either one of those becomes more difficult. So some of the twos that we have might become ones effectively. So we have 4 twos that happened throughout kind of early discussion. Will, then Lula, and Will.
Okay, so I'm up.
Yes.
Okay. So Michael, yeah, I want to pick up on this issue of the level at which the theory is operating, because I think you guys can do a better job just being more clear and more specific there, and taking more care to draw the hypotheses before you get to thinking about and discussing the data collection. And so it seems to me there's 2 dimensions that you're interested in at the group level, and I guess specifically at the mid-level commander level, but for convenience I'm just going to call that the group. So, and one of those is the extent to which the fighters in that group are committed to whatever ideology is. So when we go down to the individual level, we're going to get variation over that. We move back up to the group level, right? We've got both a mean and a variance over the level of commitment that these combatants display toward whatever ideological content they're receiving, right? So that's one dimension you're interested in. But the dimension that you're more interested in, I think, and for good reason, is well, what is that content, and specifically for you guys, does that content so does it contain some sort of I went Old Testament here, and so I'm just going to call it "Thou shalt not kill non-combatants." Right. So if we think of that as one endpoint of a unidimensional space, that's the only part of the content, right? The only thing in the content of the ideological message is "Thou shalt not kill non-combatants," and over on the the far end is Colonel Kurtz with his story of from Apocalypse Now of cutting off the arms of the babies, and after they were
Is this
inoculated.
a 2 or a 1, man?
It's a 2.
Okay, normally they're 30 seconds to a minute.
Oh, seriously? I'm going to start timing you, bro.
You should.
All right. So what I'm wondering then is, could you do more to explain at the mechanism what it is you expect, either from individuals in a survey or at the group level? And I was thinking, and it turns out that this is what you do, but I think you can make it more clear in the paper, that early on in the paper you can make it more clear that your hypothesis at the group level, but you're going to drop down to the individual level to collect information, because that's going to give you information about the mean and the variance. Am I on target?
You are. Sorry, I was muted. Yes, you are, Will. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Okay.
Okay, I'm just make the presumption that every 2 that we had earlier is really a 1, and so from hereafter on, we're then highly more interactive. Zach, you're up next. Then Tom, Meredith, Eula, and Gary.
Okay, great. Yeah, my 2 is definitely a 1 now, so perfect call. Michael, really interesting paper. I like where this project is going, and I think it's got some really great data. First, I agree with most of what Jessie said in terms of theory and empirics. My comment right now is focused on the respondents that I think you do use to form the basis of your regression. I think it's the 318 ex-combatants. And I have 2 main comments on that. One, it's not quite clear to me how those then aggregate into your regressions. I assume you have some data on when they were combatants and where they were, and every time you see an attack in their block, you assume they were involved. But just more data on how you go from those few to about the 4,000 or so attacks. And then, I completely understand how hard it is to know how ex-combatants are compared to the people who are still there, who are still combatants. But one thought I had, well, first off, you do say they aren't that different than the ex-combatants who didn't interview, but I would like to see more on that. I mean, that's a strong claim, and I don't know if you have descriptive stats or interviews with officials, but that's pretty key to your sampling, to defending your sampling, and so I'd like to see more on that. One thought I had on convincing me was if you could just do some qualitative interviews with staff at these reintegration centers. I expect they know the whole range of ex-combatants, not just the ones you've talked to, and they could provide some good information on the representativeness of your sample. That's all.
Michael, I'm just going to presume, and if you're not going to respond, then I'll just move on the queue.
That's awesome. Thanks, Zach. Yep. Thanks, Christian.
Okay, cool. Tom.
Thanks very much. So my question actually was a 2-finger, but I also have a 1-finger, so I'll just go with the 1-finger here and just add the 2-finger to begin with. So the 2-finger was, do I buy this, on your question, Michael, do I buy the transmission mechanism? And the answer is yes, if you phrase it as an assumption that the the commanders or the higher level folks you're interviewing are the ones who make the operational or tactical decisions, and that the foot soldiers are just carrying this out. Now that's an assumption, it may not be true, but if you frame it that way, then I'm ready to believe it. So my one finger, which is, I think, maybe more interesting, is on your conceptualization of ideology. And so the last bit of your conceptualization of ideology has embedded within it a set of actions that are designed to meet objectives. And that to me is interesting because that's not what I think an ideology has. I think of an ideology as something broader and something more sort of less guided towards specific goal-seeking behaviors. And so it's something that you might want to flag as a bit different than what your readers might expect. But also when you apply this to your ideology, the ideologies that you actually measure, I want to see the survey items that capture exactly what those actions to meet objectives are. So if what you're finding, for example, is that an ideology says don't invade towns, and that indeed people who believe that don't invade towns, that would be uninteresting to me. However, if you're finding that protecting the interests of the masses as a sort of diffuse thing that doesn't itself recommend any specific sort of action, if that then correlates with people not invading towns, then I'm jazzed about your idea here. That's it for me.
Yeah, so my two on that actually was that you seem to kind of implicitly suggest that ideology equals command, and I don't think that's necessarily what you mean. Commands might be nested within an ideology, but you just seem to kind of make them equivalent. And Meredith?
Yeah, so can you hear me? So I think this is actually sort of a two-finger off of that, is how ideology is framed as sort of having these independent direct effects on combatant behavior. And as soon as you got talking about that...
Can you speak louder, Meredith?
Yeah. As soon as you got talking about how there was an emphasis on civilian collaboration, it made me think that what if there is... that ideology in this instance is more of a mediating variable. So given that given that FARC and ELN rely heavily on villages and local populations for logistics support, recruitment, they might be from that area, their family is from that area. Does the ideology itself sort of help emphasize protecting civilians? So if you sort of eliminated that initial need to rely on civilian support, then it being a mediating variable, suddenly we wouldn't see ideology matter as much. So I was really interested in sort of, the relationship between an ideology that promotes protection of civilians and the strategic necessity to protect civilians. Because what I thought might be happening is you're just seeing, a strategic necessity to protect civilians for a variety of reasons. So.
Michael, you want to respond, or?
Sure. Maybe I can respond to a bunch of things that folks have said. Thanks, Christian. Wow. So these are really fantastic comments. Lots of food for thought. I think, Zach, you're right that we can go a long way with lots of qualitative stuff, and we just don't here, and it's a missed opportunity. So getting back into the field and talking to folks in some of these reintegration centers and getting their sense of whether folks that have been interviewed are representative, that would help a lot. Tom, I think so I'm interested in learning from you what definitions of ideology don't center around goal-seeking behaviors. Because I think implicit, so there's sort of an ideology in the American politics sense, which has to do with knowledge economizing kinds of devices for ways of structuring complex inputs that makes the world somewhat easier to understand. And I understand how that side of ideology is not goal-seeking behavior related. But I think the way that, even in sort of the informal, vague way that we talk about ideology and conflict, typically does involve some definition of a group and then does involve some understanding of the kinds of steps that need to be taken to fulfill that ideology. I don't, so I'm not totally sure if that's outside of the typical definition. I just don't think that the typical definitions have been rigorously defined all that much, at least within civil conflict. But I'm interested in hearing from you about that, and I'm glad to know that you would buy the transmission mechanism if the things that you said do hold. So that's cool. Yeah, Meredith, in terms of ideology as a mediating variable, so I think what's interesting is that even in places where the FARC is not relying nearly as much on civilians for things like resources and shelter, because they're relying much more on natural resource streams, and we've coded this in the regressions, things like oil, things like coca growth, things like gemstones. We still see this effect of ideology, which is sort of fascinating. So that, at least from the empirical side, tells me that ideology is not simply a mediating variable. But I'd be interested in knowing whether you think that's convincing or not. We can probably do more work on the theoretical side to make that case. But it's, somewhat in the abstract. Theoretically, it's harder to make that case than just sort of seeing if that holds in the Colombian context. And in terms of the strategic necessity of protecting civilians, again, arguing from empirics, it seems like territorial contestation or patterns of violence between the government, between paramilitaries and insurgents, don't mediate the relationship between ideology that we find and violence against these different targets. But again, I don't know if that's convincing to you guys, and I'd be interested to hear if it's not.
2 on response before moving to Eula. You might use some of the language of framing, the kind of diagnostic versus prognostic, because ideology seems to kind of include this kind of general sense of a worldview, but you might pull it down a little bit more to kind of think about tactically what's involved. Gary, you had a 2 on this point? You need to unmute first.
First of all, I think this is the first time I've done this group, so I'm Gary Gertz, and for those of you who don't know me. Just a bibliographic footnote, John Gehring has written quite a bit on the concept of ideology, so that might be one place you could go to think about those kinds of things.
You like...
I had 2 fingers. One was I wanted to also know a little bit more about the survey. Like, I wasn't quite sure what the service items actually contained and what you actually proposing. For example, Meredith was proposing the question.
Sorry, I can't quite hear you. Would you be able to speak up? I apologize.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's better.
Okay, I'll just speak up. So I was wondering more about the survey items, which also Jessie already mentioned. I would like to know more about what you actually quote from respondents, because, for example, one way to address Meredith's issue would be to ask whether respondents actually came from the regions where they also lived in the guerrilla. For example, that would be interesting to know. My personal question was, because you were so interested in whether we are buying this theory, and I think what would help you to flesh out the mechanism to be more specific on how that entire decision-making process actually works and how ideology plays in there. Because what I would like to know more about is how military tactics play into this, or like combat tactics. For example, for me, it's also a question of the availability of targets. So are specific targets actually available at a certain point in time in a specific location, or is it more by situation or circumstance, what's actually there right now, what I'm going to target? So how does that decision-making process actually work? Because maybe in some regions certain targets are more readily available than others, and then you could also control for that in empirical analysis. I think that's important to control whether certain targets are actually available or not. And maybe there also could be substitution effects between different target types, between different target strategies, that if one is not available, I'm going for the other. So since you're running 5 different impressions in these tactics, I would be more curious to see what actually happens if you kind of integrate them in one model.
Yeah, so Michael, my two on your list thing directly in line with this is there's really very little about the progression or digression of the kind of like conflict effort. So it's just like, how is the conflict generally doing? How were things just taking place recently? Is there out-migration from a particular location? The context within which each observation exists, like lag repression or lag, some kind of sense of the kind of trajectory, or Will's stuff on sequences, I thought would have provided some more context for this. But response, if any?
Yeah, so this is really, really useful. In terms of availability of targets, so I think there are two ways to respond. One is theoretically. So do I think that the targets are substitutable? In other words, armed groups decide, hey, we need to attack something today, and it's either going to be civilians or a military post, military installation, and then ideology intervenes and said, hey, we can't attack civilians because we believe that they're important for our war effort. It's not quite that coarse, that rough, but I think that is sort of where ideology intervenes about the usefulness, the strategic utility, but also the normative acceptability of engaging in those kinds of acts of violence. I think what's largely missing from this paper, many things, but one of the things that's missing is precisely this logic of decision making at the commander level, but also how maybe decisions are reliably or not carried out by foot soldiers. So that's one thing. And to Christian's question about the context within which each of these decisions is made, we try to get at this qualitatively when discussing the different phases of the conflict, but given that our empirical assessment takes place within one phase, we don't get into sort of micro phases. And of course, the conflict plays out differently, radically differently in different zones, in different regions of the country. And one way of capturing this is qualitatively through more narrative about the zones within which each of the blocks operates, or each of the frentes operates. But another may be to capture it empirically with sort of region dummies. I don't know how useful that's going to be. And actually that gets back to another question that was asked about the area variable. That's just actually the size of a municipality, as opposed to, Jessie, I think that was your point, as opposed to a region in which a municipality was located. But this is all very useful. I want to stop talking for now.
Jessie, you had a quick intervention, and then Karolina?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on the strategic question, and ask if you can disaggregate in your survey responses to items more normatively focused versus items more strategically focused, and just reiterate my encouragement for you to include perhaps region dummies or something to get at that area issue.
Karolina? Oh, sorry, Michael, did you want to say something?
Yes, so that's very, very useful.
Michael, you good?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was having trouble unmuting. I don't think that we can actually disaggregate items in the survey that are more normatively focused versus strategic, because and this actually gets to one of the other questions about how the survey is structured. These are Likert item responses about extent to which combatants, ex-combatants, agreed with or believed in the ideologies of Bolivarianism, which is this weird, seemingly only Latin American thing, and some other ideological commitments. So I wish there were a way. I wish we could go back in time. How many times have we said that and changed the way a survey is structured? But that's not going to happen, clearly. So maybe a new survey needs to be run, and that would be useful. In terms of region dummies, sure, absolutely, we can do that. I mean, that's going to roughly correspond to block-level dummies, because blocks are assigned to specific regions. So it begs the question, why don't we have block dummies? So that's a useful thing, too. Thanks.
Karolina? Oh, sorry. Okay, no. Okay, Karolina's been sitting there, so I'm going to let her
So interviewing ex-combatants also presents a little bit of a selection issue for another reason, and that's because people often leave groups because they're disillusioned with the group's leadership and/or ideology. So there's a little bit of an indigeneity problem, and I was just wondering how you would deal with that. And I have some other points. I don't know if I should keep going.
So I mean, that's the million-dollar question. I have no real good answer to that. I think that's right. In some other work, though, I have looked at, my co-authors and I have systematically compared combatants who were captured in combat to those who demobilized out of choice, and we don't find significant differences across ideology. It's not this survey, and it's just about how often they attended ideological meetings. We don't find significant differences between combatants who were captured, sort of an exogenous shock that took them out of combat, and those who demobilized individually by choice in terms of how often they attended meetings. But yeah, I wish I had a better answer for that.
Meredith had a quick two, then Karolina, I'll give you another one.
Yeah, no, just quickly going back to sort of proving the story that this also isn't about strategic motivation or just reliance on the civilian population. I think even if you can't address it with the empirics, although you might, maybe look at, if you have information on the groups being from a specific municipality, and it turns out, that those that have moved around or operated in other municipalities, it turns out ideology is still significant. That might be one way to look at it, just to separate out where your ex-combatants are from, and that is not correlated with whether or not they target civilians. Another thing might just be to sort of walk me through the logic that you just provided me in the theory section, I think, or in the alternative hypothesis section, just because I was more convinced by what you told me than I think when I read the paper.
So you were, just to clarify, you were more convinced by what I just told you than what is said in the paper?
Yeah, yes. Because you don't really bring up the civilian strategic reliance on the civilian population within the alternative hypotheses. It does. I mean, it sort of fits with military, but not really. And so really, I just wanted, I think, some acknowledging or way to address that. Given that obviously you can't, go back and change surveys or whatever.
Yeah, sure. Well, I love this idea of trying to figure out if our ex-combatants are from where they fight. And in this particular case, we actually may be able to do that, and we just haven't. So isn't it great when that happens? Let's see. Thank you. It's a great suggestion.
Yeah, thanks.
Sure.
Karolina, one more, and then we'll pass to Gary.
So I do agree with some of the people who are saying that ideology is, the definition is kind of underspecified, and it's really not until page 6 that you go into the definition. And I think that your definition of ideology, according to your definition, is belief about how members of the group should relate to outsiders, but obviously it is going to affect tactics. Almost by definition, it affects the tactics. And also, Abrams and Potter have a paper coming out in IO that is all about predicting when militant groups target civilians and when they don't. So maybe you should take a look at that. And you're basically saying that the type of ideology matters, more so probably than the amount of ideology, because you know that there's certain kinds of ideologies that promote massive human rights abuses. Like, for example, ISIS is very ideological, and they tend to promote human rights abuses. So whether or not they attended the meetings, I was just curious how you would measure the type of ideology versus the amount, or if that's something you address at all in your paper.
So do I have the ability to respond, Christian?
Yes, you do. Cool.
Yeah, so I will definitely look up the Abrams and Potter paper, which sounds fantastic and fascinating. So I think, yes, by definition, ideology affects how members should relate to outsiders, but that doesn't make the argument tautological. And I'm not sure if that's what was suggested, because I think it's precisely this extent to which civilian casualties can be justified by the objectives, the ultimate objectives of the group, that has sort of the bite in this paper. And I like your distinction between type of ideology mattering versus intensity. And we don't have subnational variation, well, at least within the FARC, within a single armed group, we don't have subnational variation in type of ideology. What we do have subnational variation in is, in the way that Will talked about, both individual level commitment to ideologies that then get aggregated up in our regressions to basically block level variation. So it does sort of, in some ways, put us in a bind, because if I like this criticism, Karolina, because it basically says that some ideologies promote massive human rights abuses, others don't. We don't have variation on that measure. So how is it that we can claim that ideology is what's doing the work? And I just need to think more about it. I mean, amount of commitment or intensity of ideology is what we're measuring. So what does it mean to believe less in an ideology? Yeah, it's underspecified.
Gary.
I had a number of methodological comments, so let me just give you a couple of them. These are actually related to ongoing projects I have, so I have high levels of self-interest. So one is you have a fairly long discussion of how representative the survey is. And I'm doing a thing on multi-method. I'm doing a book on multi-methods, and I'm sort of curious because, you know, in experiments, the experimenters don't really care whether their subjects are representative of anything. So I'm not sure why you are concerned about whether their subjects are representative of anything as well. Now, of course, there's selection issues, but that's separate from representativeness. So I'm sort of curious about whether you really need to have anything about representative or not, just give a selection. The second is these logits, whatever you have at the end. So the other thing, I actually just yesterday gave a talk on how problematic nominal typologies are. And so it looks like you're running the same thing on the whole data set. And so I'm curious, the bottom line might be that I'm not sure these things mean anything at all. So the question is, what's the zero category? So is there 1 on all these various things, and then everything else is 0 in those various analyses? Let me give you my canonical example. So Pepinsky Norris did this thing where the dependent variable was conflict. The independent variable was like regime type. And she had a variable which was PR, 0 or 1. The ones were clear, but the zeros included the United States and North Korea. So I'm not sure what her PR variable was measuring at all, because of this weird 0 group is just this hodgepodge of stuff. Now, when you have it as a dependent variable, probably most people would say you're in the competing risks framework, and that would be the way to go for it on, you know, if it's the dependent variable side. So but it wasn't quite clear to me what you actually did in those statistics. So, you know, I may have misunderstood what you were doing. But those would be kind of 2 things to think about.
Go ahead, Michael.
Okay, so for some reason, I have trouble unmuting. It's a problem. I apologize. So fantastic. I think on the first point about representativeness, it's in there because I know what reviewers will say, which is a terrible reason to include things in a paper. But you know, I think experiments have the advantage of having a group of reviewers that don't care about those things. But people who work with surveys have a group of reviewers that do worry, not just worry, but fixate on those things. And so the question is really like, what is it that we want to explain? Are we interested in primarily explaining how demobilized combatants' ideologies affected conflict behavior? Are we interested in explaining how combatants, all combatants, ideologies affected conflict behavior. If the question is the latter, then I actually do think that we need to worry about representativeness, because I'm not sure that I agree that that's a separate issue from selection, because if it's a self-selected group of people who are opting into this survey or opting into demobilization, then we have an unrepresentative survey, right? The sample frame is wrong. So, I mean, maybe you want to push back and tell me why I'm wrong about thinking about those two things as separate things.
Again, you're interested in the effect of ideology on, and so what you're doing, I think, is right. You're talking about selection. To what extent have we a biased treatment? Getting a certain sort of treated person that's different in the.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm saying treatment, the selection is an issue there.
Got it.
But whether they're representative of the whole population of combatants, I don't.
Sure. So, okay. And I'm good with that. I still think that if we don't include this stuff, we're going to get hammered.
Well, I would agree with that. Because everyone, why I was interested in this, because this is, everyone sort of asks this question, like when case studies, is your case study representative of your population? I'm going, well, what does it mean to be representative anyway? That's not clear.
Yeah.
You try to define representative, it's problematic. Blah, blah,
sure.
blah. Yeah.
Okay. Useful to think about. I mean, there is a professional incentives argument that sort of.
I know. I'm pragmatic. I know. I've done plenty of things that I go and ask for, forgiveness later.
Yeah, this will be one of my sins. So in terms of the second point, so this is actually, I started thinking about this. Initially, Juan, my co-author, and I were concerned about a different kind of selection problem, which is that maybe some kind of frente, some kind of sub-units within the FARC didn't have sufficient capability to carry out any kind of attack. And so basically, we're only viewing the attacks that actually happened, the armed activity that occurred, and so basically you're truncating the sample. So that's one form of sort of dealing with. There's a one finger that's been being signaled here. That's one question, and I think empirically we can say that that's not true. That all of these subunits were sufficiently capable of carrying out at least some of these attacks. So that's one sort of answer. The second question is when we were talking about military tactics, like representing this. So the way that you think about it theoretically is going to affect the way that you model it empirically or statistically test it. So is this a multinomial kind of logit world in which we should be looking at how intensity of ideology affects the risk of being placed into different categories of attacks? And I sort of sat with that for a little while and wasn't sure about whether that's the right approach. And it sounds to me like you actually maybe saying that it might be. But then, yeah, so I would be interested in hearing from all of you about whether you think that's the way that we've modeled it now approximates the way that it should be modeled.
So can I
quick?
That'd be great.
So one of the things I would just propose, if you want to stay out of the multinomial world, which is always a good idea.
Yeah, I know.
Because you're really interested in attacks against civilians and military targets. So why don't you just collapse? I don't know if that's possible. That sort of essentially they have a choice: civilian targets or military targets, and you have a dichotomous dependent variable, which is actually getting at what we want to get at to begin with. Again, I don't know.
Good. No, that's actually really useful, and I think part of the frustration that I have with this literature, which I'm guilty of this myself, is that we tend to not look at tactics. We tend to just look at numbers of civilians killed, and we don't think about the alternative possibilities that face rebels. So they have options about target selection, just like standing militaries do have the option of target selection. And when we don't consider that, then we're missing a huge sort of portion of the variation. That's interesting. So maybe we're getting halfway there if we collapse civilian versus military. Maybe that's a useful way to go. I'd be interested in hearing from others as well.
You're on it too.
So on this question of civilian versus military targeting,
can you speak louder?
Yeah. On tactics.
Yeah.
Can you explain to me why you consider a non-takeover to be an attack on civilians? Is that, I mean, can you hear me?
So an armed takeover, why I consider that to be an attack on civilians?
Yeah, because, I mean, if you're trying to take over a town, why would you attack a civilian target? You go after the police stations, because that's where the weapons are. You go after the town hall, the city council building. You go after the prosecutor's office. You take control over the television towers and radio stations, rail stations. If you're going after civilian targets instead of those places, you're not trying to take over that town. So why should I interpret armed takeover attempt of a town as an attack against civilians?
So that's a good question. I think you're right that oftentimes attempts to take over towns involve attacks on the infrastructure of the military or the infrastructure of the government that's present in these towns, but a lot of these towns don't have those things. Or some of them anyway. In highly rural areas, there oftentimes are not police stations, there are not prosecutors' offices. So I don't know if that actually answers your question, and maybe I just need to think more about this, but so do you think that the killing of civilians, the killing of potential collaborators with the enemy within a given town is an attempted takeover of the town or not?
No. Look, if you're trying to take over town, well, you target civilians to deter them from collaborating with you.
Yep.
That's different from trying to control a territory, and I mean, maybe I could just use a little more elaboration as to maybe some specific examples of the types of takeovers that you're talking about. Because I don't understand how you can control a town, even a small village, without at least taking over the police station, or at least taking over whatever elements of the government that are locally present.
Yeah, so in some way, asking the question, how collinear actually are these things? So in other words, is there always an attack on a police station when there's a takeover of town? Right? I mean, that's...
Well, or do they code an attack on a police station?
Okay, good.
Take over the town.
Okay.
Yeah, and I have some other questions as well, but I'll leave those for my one finger.
Well, coming back to you in a one in a few here. Actually, I was left on the queue, but
Sorry,
mine actually follows this one pretty well, which was I think the tactics are related to one another, and the way that you conceive it, it's kind of like individuals are they're contemplating whether or not dichotomously to do tactic one. So this is kind of back to Gary. But if Tilly's idea of a repertoire is correct, though, right? You're thinking of a constellation of different tactics simultaneously, and then what kind of fits within that package. So I understand the comments about wanting to stay out of the kind of like multinomial world, but nevertheless, these are packages, right? And so the tactics are viewed together, and that campaign changes. Related to that, I want to push on this issue of kind of different ways about ideology mattering, right? So I think there's a general expectation of what kind of tactic or what kind of group of tactics you're going to use as a function of how the conflict effort is going. But what I think ideology cuts in on, in many respects, I would trust it a little bit more, is let's say that you've just been attacked in a particular manner by the authorities, they engaged in violence, they did something else, and you would expect that a tactical response to that would be tit for tat in kind. You would go at them in the same way. But that's exactly when ideology should matter, which kind of maybe gets back to this intermediary point. But in order to get there, you need to kind of have a baseline model for, okay, what kind of tactical repertoire would you expect? Okay, now let us interact ideology, and look, we see this mediating effect that they're not responding in kind. It's not tit for tat. The ideology has been kind of representative there. The last kind of point, or related to this, was my friends who actually study ideology, I think they'd be upset that you kind of like lumped all Marxists together and that you weren't nuancing between like Leninists and Trotskyites and Stalinists. I mean, like, so that even the Bolivarian kind of idea is kind of out there, but you have this general sense of a worldview, you have a general sense of the value of human life, and then you have this tactical thing that you'd like to win. And that matching or not matching to what you do in the field, I'd want to see a little bit. I'd want to see a little bit more in this. I view this piece as kind of like the teaching moment to kind of like really break down exactly what ideology is, what commands are, and generally what you'd expect under different circumstances. And that's when I think the ideology would kick in. And I think I saw Jessie with it too, which means it's on this point, right, Jessie?
I think she may be frozen.
Fascinating. Okay, I thought she was really thinking there for a second. Okay, so Michael, you want to respond, or you want to keep moving?
Yeah, no, this is all really useful, and I think you're right about the constellation of tactics things. You know, I think trying to figure out moments at which a tactic could have been opted for and would have been the so-called rational, sort of on the equilibrium path response, and then seeing how ideology intervened in some way is really useful. Obviously, it's going to be impossible in a regression context, which is totally fine, and it would require more field work, and that's okay too. It just hasn't been done yet because we haven't had the time or the resources. So maybe that's where we need to go next. Once we sort of nail down more clearly what this theoretical story is about the decision-making process through which commanders select tactics and inculcate their lower-level combatants into a belief about what kinds of tactics should be used, given sort of different conditions of state repression, how the war effort's going, and so forth. And then we talk about precisely that there was this inflection point where it could have gone one way but went a different way because of ideology. And I think that would be a great paper if we can pull it off. That's always an open question about whether we can. And this last point about Marxist guerrillas, yeah, I mean anybody who works on Colombia is indoctrinated him or herself into the idea that these are very that different forms of Marxism matter a whole lot, not just because of the ideas that are circulated, but because of the kinds of networks in which you're embedded as a result of subscribing to one or the other kind of strain of sort of communist, Marxist, Leninist, insert whatever ist you want here. So in Colombia, maybe more than anywhere, that's important, and we should just highlight it and make it clear. So, point well taken, Christian. Thanks.
Jessie, are you back? Jessie, you want to do it? No. Yes. Unmute.
Yeah. Sorry. All right. So mine was very much in that vein, right? In terms of the type of ideology and what effect that has, and how you differentiate between these different strains of Marxism, and then how you think your research in terms of theory could be generalized beyond the study that you've done. So how would you sort of talk about that?
If at all.
Oh man. Yeah. So full admission to the small crowd gathered here. So I work mostly on Colombia, and I'm always sort of pushed to think beyond Colombia because that's what reviewers do, and I think it's right and it's important. In terms of the specific mechanisms through which ideology affects behavior, especially in non-Marxist insurgencies, and again, Marxist insurgencies, broadly speaking, maybe with the exception of the Peruvian one, tend to stress the importance of civilian collaboration and respect for civilian populations, in part because they're fighting on behalf of the peasantry, or claiming to. In other cases, that's not the case. And so I'm just sort of circling around here, Jessie, in part because this is a task to be completed, and probably should make an appearance not just in the conclusion as is traditional, the sort of three-sentence how this would apply to other places, because people told me I had to speculate on that, but maybe could be useful for orienting a theory section as well, and helping us to derive some clearer mechanisms by looking at other places. So that's very useful. Thank you.
Yuri, then Tom.
But so, Michael, I'm wondering if there's a difference in your mind between ideology and doctrine. Can I do a search and replace on this paper and replace every instance of ideology with military doctrine, and then come up with a similar argument and the same story? Because it strikes me that a lot of the concerns that are being raised here are about what extent are is this ideological indoctrination a response to local circumstances and a response to what various commanders believe is militarily effective on the ground. And it's more effective for us to collaborate with civilians rather than attack them.
Yeah.
That's what we do for cadres. But that, I mean, that just sounds to me like that's military doctrine, because I mean, ideology is like we have an ideal point and we believe this is right and this is what we're going to do.
Yeah.
Doctrine is more based on what we believe is effective, and that's what we'll implement.
Yeah, so in some ways that actually goes back to, I think, Tom's point about the goal-oriented nature of our definition of ideology. So if you were to strip that away, then there is a big difference between ideology and doctrine, right? In which there aren't specific actions that are proscribed or prescribed, So the leftists' ideology is really the right's doctrine. Interesting. I don't know. I mean, maybe. I got to think about it more. That's useful, though.
Okay,
so,
if
just one quick thing, Christian. So, doctrine? How would you define doctrine, Yuri?
Well, a doctrine would be like it's basically an application of theory. It's to have a theory that X causes Y. I want to create Y. What are the conditions that I need to create on the ground to create Y? And my theory, if my theory says X causes Y, then that means I need to create X. So that's.
Yeah, I wondered if it's just a level of abstraction that is involved in each. So ideologies tend to be much more vague, but that may just be a poorly constructed doctrine.
But the way you define doctrine, I mean, ideology is very specific, right?
Yeah, that's right. And this definition between in-group and out-group.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably present in some military doctrines, but probably not all, right? I don't know. I got to think about it. Thank you. That's actually really useful.
Yeah. Karolina on a 2. Oh, sorry. You have another one? Go ahead, Yuri.
Yeah, I just want to throw my other points on the table. Then
hold on. Before you get there, Karolina had a 2 on that particular point, then we'll go back to you. Go ahead, Karolina.
I have a sort of similar point to make. If the leader is opposed to civilian targeting, then we would expect the foot soldiers to be less likely to target civilians if communicated properly and if there's no principal agency problem. So it almost seems to me like communication between the foot soldiers and mid-level commanders is doing the work. So this communication could be about strategy and not necessarily ideology. So, for example, it could be just that targeting civilians, it's not strategically advantageous, so they really indoctrinate the foot soldiers not to target civilians. So I guess my question is, how would you make a stronger distinction between the strategy and the ideology if it's not communication that's doing the work?
Okay, he's thinking. Yuri, go.
Yeah, my other points are relatively minor. I just want to agree with pretty much everything that Gary said on the modeling side, and as because it is not clear what the reference category is.
Yeah.
Just to be among all these. I also think that multinomial choice models may not be the direction you want to go if you want to be able to actually interpret these results.
Yes.
In a meaningful way. Nor is simultaneous equation model necessarily going to help you very much. But there are probably the most that you can do to dispel a lot of the concerns in this room is address this this selection, this ideological selection problem that we're pointing out. Perhaps it would just like, I don't know if there's some kind of two-stage model that you can create. So you have data on the local conditions of population, oil, and so on. All the various things that people might think might influence the content of ideology. So why not just run some kind of two-stage model in which the first stage you can model what causes ideology, what determines ideology, and the second you maybe the effect of ideology conditional on this pre-treatment phase. What is the impact of ideology? And there's also in a matter of because right now like in some of them like your first table about attempted takeovers. So the larger the population, the less likely an attempted takeover is.
Mm-hmm.
So an obvious reply to that is like, so in places where there's a lot of population, it'll be harder to take over towns, so they're going to give out content that will emphasize that this is not a good idea.
Okay.
If you take care of this in the first stage, then that just solves some of those problems.
Okay, cool.
Also, it's a matter of personal taste. I don't like odds ratios. It's not clear to me what we learned from them. And in one of them, and I don't know what's going on with this cocoa cultivation variable. And in general, if you have 12 zeros at the end of an odds ratio,
huge. I mean, tiny, yeah.
Well, obviously the effect is enormous. It's enormous. Yeah.
Okay, that's a bit too much at the moment. Gary, you had a quick one.
Selection thing. Can I go back to the selection thing for a minute? You still hear me, everyone?
Yeah.
So, I was just thinking about this as Yuri was talking, because really this was another one of my methodological comments. Really, the unit of analysis is the block. Right? I mean, so instead of thinking about all these issues of representativeness of individuals and selection, one of the ways you could pitch it is what are these individuals doing, and just giving you information about the block.
Yep.
The question is the information about the block accurate or not? It's of how representative people might be. So, they might have, so you can read the task that is, how reliable is this information about the block? And maybe that might be irrelevant to why you were captured or you mobilized. That's where it's going to analysis actually probably should be well, is the block.
Okay, we're losing sound a little bit on Michigan. Could you all mute and then come back off the mute? But let me get Tom to go quick, but he's about to leave.
All right, sorry.
Thanks, guys, and sorry that I've got to run to a faculty meeting. But let me just give you a couple sort of boring research designing comments, which some of which have been raised and some of which have not been. So the first thing that as I've been hearing this discussion, I actually don't know, if I were a reviewer, what the unit of analysis is in the paper, and so sometimes I think it's like a municipality or something like that. So it could be completely unviolent. Sometimes I think it's an attack, and so it's only types of attacks here. And then it's peculiar for me to then see us assign average ideological scores at this much higher level of aggregation to those in a sort of explanatory capacity, especially since we have, Gary says we have essentially seven blocks, and we have more than 4,000 observations, and so that leads me to question if there's something mechanical about the nested structure of the data that's giving us the statistical significance that we seem to be learning from. And on that note, I would just observe that in Table 1, the variation in average ideological score is from 1.9 to 2.2 on a scale of, first off, on a scale of what to what? What's the variance around those within the different blocks? The more that I hear us talk, the more that I wonder that there may be something in the way that we're estimating these logit models that just produces statistical significance through a large N, and so a limited amount of variation being applied to that. And I'm sorry, I'll have to take my comments off the air, or your response off the air. But thanks very much for involving me all, and you guys have a great day. Bye.
Thanks to you, Tom.
Tom, good exit, Tom. Good exit. Okay, Gary, quickly.
He drops the mic and runs off.
So did I think I was done? Did you? With the block?
Oh, if you were done, Michael, were you fine with his comments? Did you understand what he was saying?
Sort of. So basically, let me just paraphrase and make sure I was right. So the unit of analysis you're saying is the block, and so the question of representativeness is really just how accurate is the info about the block or not. Is that basically the thrust?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Good.
You can sort of diffuse a lot of the selection arguments by things about, information about the block.
Okay, Will, you're up.
Okay, so I had two comments, one of which I'm pretty sure we just hit with Gary, which is you keep talking about the representativeness relative to those in the field, but what I really want to know is whether or not this is representative for the block. That's the issue, and there isn't enough attention to that. I also just thought Tom's point on the limited variance is a really good one, and give us some information on that. And then I'll just to be quick, because we've got a couple of other people to let them get in as well. I want to know, and this won't surprise you given my work, right? But I want to know what the state's doing. At least as a control, right? Because I don't. Right now, you're treating there by not including the state's coercive behavior in the area. You're ignoring that as if it's you're basically zeroing that, saying that's not having an effect, and I don't think any of us believe that. Second, I think you're missing a real opportunity to engage Clevis, despite the fact that you're citing Clevis quite frequently. And if my understanding of the data that's available in Columbia is correct, you have real opportunities to look at the number of people in that block relative to the number of soldiers that are also in that region, and have some ability to then try to control for that story, which is an alternative rival that you really leave aside, right? Is that Clevis argues that, well, it's really about the balance of control, whether or not we'll see civilian killing, and that should be true for your FARC blocks as well.
Michael, you good?
Just one quick thing. So Will, we include number of combats, sort of engagement with the armed forces, and airstrikes by the Colombian military as controls. Are those sufficient to deal with the state? Which is kind of
my bad. Okay.
But do you think that's enough, or do you not?
I didn't think so, but I don't know which way Will's going. I didn't think so.
But the number of combats, again, is the number of soldiers in the area?
Clashes. Sorry, it should really just be clashes.
Okay. I'm also interested in, clashes is, right, isn't that in effect one of the variables you're interested in, is how often are they engaging the military as opposed to, right? So I was actually more interested in soldiers, and then I want to know, clashes is an interaction.
Yeah, that's right.
So airstrikes are not.
Airstrikes sort of get you there, but not
airstrikes are good, and I had just forgotten about them as I was making my comment. But I'd like to see the number of soldiers and some other measure of, if you can get it.
Yeah, number of soldiers in an area would be awesome, and those are data that I've been trying to get for a while, and they have not been forthcoming. But we do have things like military bases that potentially could be useful.
So my two on that, adding to Will's comment about kind of like the general relationship about kind of state-challenger relationships, where this whole issue of trajectory, right? So it's like, it's not just the number of clashes, it's just like, how well did those clashes go the last time for you? And is the conflict moving in your direction or away from it? So it's more of trajectory and context that way. Eula.
You are muted. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. I have a different comment on your data, because reading your paper and listening to you now in our meeting, I have the impression that you're making assumptions about your data that you're not stating, and I'm wondering if you think those assumptions are true or not. One seems to be that you're saying that you have a data set that has really attack, so that you actually know all FARC attacks that did happen, And I'm wondering about that because you are working with a source by the government, and I'm curious whether the government has any interest in maybe downplaying attacks committed against the military, because they probably are also under public pressure to show that they are handling the situation very well. And so I'm wondering how confident you actually are that your data really represent every attack that's meaning. And then the other question is that you're also, since you're disaggregating different tactics, like different types of attacks, there's also like a homogeneity assumption, because you are assuming that every type of attack is equally reported and equally likely to be captured in your data. But there could be a reason why there is variation both over space as well as over time in terms of what types of attacks are going to be reported in this database or covered, captured, so forth. So the question is, could it be that some types of attacks are more likely to be covered and reported in the data than others, and are there maybe tests that you can think of to check whether actually every type of attack is reported? So for example, could you choose one kind of area and time period where you actually do an additional search and look for another source? Maybe you have other sources available, and sources reported, attacks reported in other types of sources are actually inside your database, or if they actually complement the risk of database.
Okay.
Sorry, I think the sound quality is a little bit off with Michigan, so I'm not quite sure if you got all of that, Michael, but you could respond to whatever part you could hear.
Sure. So I think basically the thrust of the question is, do we know all FARC attacks that did happen? Does the government have an interest in downplaying attacks against the military? There's sort of a question of data reliability here. So is each type of attack equally likely to be reported? Probably not, and that's a problem. And so one thing that I think we can do is use other data sets, which we do have access to try to get at this. There's a big push, at least in Columbia and among scholars in the U.S., to work with like multiple systems estimation to try to get at reliability of some of these data sets. And maybe that's something we can do, although typically it requires aggregating to a higher level of granularity than we're interested in here. But that's certainly something that we need to talk about in the paper, potential biases in these data. So people have found variable things as to whether this particular data set is biased or not, but they haven't looked at bias across attack type. So I don't have a good answer for you there. And I think there are reasons to expect that, that there are incentives to cover up some kinds of attacks that would be embarrassing, but by the same token, this is a period when the military was ramping up its campaign against the FARC and needed to demonstrate to the people that the money they were spending on the military was worth it. And so you do that by showing threat. So I think there are those sort of competing incentives to cover up and to attract more funding that could potentially cut against one another. But good point, Eula. Thank you.
Zach.
Hi, yeah, I just have a couple estimation comments. The main one is again trying to tease out this block versus ideology effect. I think you should try block fixed effects. It's my understanding that the cocoa and all the oil, that's going to vary by observation, so you're not going to have perfect collinearity. That might soak up all your variance, but that'd be interesting to see anyway. And what that is essentially getting at, that's kind of an easy way to do a hierarchical model, which is kind of what you would have in an ideal case, right? You have these individuals who are doing their own thing, and they're in a block, which also has its own effects. You're probably not going to have enough power for a hierarchical model because you only have, 11 or 13 blocks.
Yeah.
But again, it's something to try to see what happens. And that would also be really cool because then you can see, then you're isolating the individual ideology, because then you've zeroed out you've won out all the block level commander, the ideology training, and you just have their survey responses left. It would also be really cool if block leaders change, and if we know that. I expect that's probably not data you can find. If you even had anecdotes or something, that'd be really great, because then you're going to see, oh, well, is it actually the ideological training going on in the block, or is it the leadership effects, and this guy who is now in a different block is just much more concerned about civilian casualties or not. And then also I know you just have a cross section but I would want to see some control for year fixed effects, just to make sure that you don't have some culinary between when these people are combatants and it just happens to be a low conflict year. That's all.
Those are all fantastic comments, especially the block leader change. I think there may be so there's some endogeneity between either capture of a block leader and his ability to control his combatants beneath him, which would be a confounder. But that's really interesting to take a look at, and we'll try to do that. And of course, the other suggestions, block fixed effects, are great as well. So thank you.
Okay, so I'm on the queue. So some of these are comments and some of these are kind of questions. Most of them are comments, though. So related to the last point, there's this kind of like PA, principal agent kind of spatial diffusion thing, right? So if in your block you're fighting all over the place, I would figure that it matters more what kind of is in individuals' heads than what is, in a sense, they're commanded to, right? So if you had some sense of the kind of conflict theater, then I think I'd feel a little bit more comfortable about the contextualization. To ignore that ideology has influenced or that is believed to influence state uses of violence, the literature on totalitarianism and communism and so forth, that is clearly a literature that would be relevant to what you're talking about. I was wondering if spaces wouldn't be nested, right? So Calabas's zones of contestation, is a block a separate zone, or is it connected to a broader zone in the sense that the fighting is going to be kind of nested in particular areas with regards to his 1 through 5 zones? I've never seen anyone actually operationalize those 5 zones, but you're treating each block as if it could be in a separate location in those zones, and I'm wondering if you're surrounded by completely areas that are completely dominant by the government, and then you're that one spot in the middle, that seems to be a very different scenario than another type of nesting. All your tactics are kind of coercive in nature, which I'm usually all about, right? But you could also use normative or kind of material power, and so I lose some sense of exactly what's going on there. The last one's clearly a comment. All our pieces seem to talk about like policy implications, right? And I'm just like, this pro-government focus thing is really starting to annoy me. I'm just like, what about implications for challengers? What about implications for citizens? It's like all we're doing is trying to help governments, and so this gratuitous kind of mentioning of policy implications, privileging governments, I'm finding like problems with. So at least we need to kind of vary it to get some sense of what the other actors are, because clearly not all governments are nice, right? So policy implications might not be the thing that we uniformly want to support.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no. Quick responses.
Like 5 too, evidently, yeah.
Quick responses to those. Yeah, no, I love this idea that we should be drawing on the sort of state-based ideology literature, and it's sort of amazing that it's overlooked here, so that's really useful. And I think you're right that zones of control and how they map onto different blocks will vary across blocks and across time as well, which of course makes it even more challenging to try to model this. And yes, of course, so, earlier on, I said that previous literature had basically truncated variation on the dependent variable by only looking at violence against civilians and not violence against government targets. And we're, of course, further truncating, or we've expanded it but then truncated it again by not looking at non-coercive offers, which, of course, are really hard to get at, hard to measure, but it's worth acknowledging. In terms of policy implications, I actually don't know that making reintegration programs more effective can only be seen as helping the government. I actually think that preventing recidivism to armed groups is something that benefits individuals who were once engaged in armed groups, provided that they have jobs, provided that they have potentially more fulfilling lives outside of armed groups. So I agree. It's too much focused on the state, typically, in policy implications. We need to do more here to think about effects on citizens, everyday citizens, and the combatants themselves. So yes, I'll stop there.
Q is open. I'm sure everyone's got a bunch of comments they've been holding back. I know I do, but the
Don't
queue is
hold
open.
back.
Who'd like to go? Gary.
So could you apply all this to regular soldiers of the state? So, for example, you can do surveys of people in the U.S. Why do they join the military? For ideological, monetary, education, right? So, could the framework be portable to the state soldiers as well?
So probably, although I don't really work on state militaries. It's such a typical Civil War person thing to say. But I think what differentiates them. So maybe it applies better to militaries that are fighting counterinsurgency than it does to militaries that aren't, because the challenge that insurgents face on a day-to-day basis in trying to interact with civilian populations is mirrored only by counterinsurgents. And of course, counterinsurgents face different challenges, like the difficulty of identifying collaborators and regular civilians. But it's a good question and something certainly worth thinking about.
Well, there's why were all those Afghanis and Iraqis in there?
Yeah.
Zach.
Yeah. So let's see. On page 11 in your paper, just before you get to the data empirical strategy, you talk more about these block leaders. And I know we keep coming back to this. And you talk about how they're also in charge of military concepts as well. And so I wonder if some of this decrease in targeting of civilians, which you attribute to ideology, could just be better military training as well, right? So if we just, again, it's the leader competency thing. But perhaps what you're actually picking up on is better training overall, and some of that goes to ideology, but a lot of that is using better weapons, better intelligence, better targeting, stuff like that.
It's a package deal, right? I wouldn't say this in a paper, but it's really hard to disaggregate these things because they often come together. But the point is well taken. I mean, maybe one way of teasing this out is to see, as we try to do qualitatively, is see like what the resources are available to a block leader. You might think that would translate into better weaponry, better hardware that's available, and sort of once you control for that, if ideology is still something that helps to explain targeting, you maybe would have more confidence. I'm not sure.
You probably already get at that though with your oil and gin and coca control.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah, I don't know.
So, Michael, kind of like, do you have anything that you'd like to kind of query to the group, having heard all of this thus far? The good thing about having this thing taped is you can go back and listen to stuff that you might have missed, but on the spot right now,
yeah, no, I mean,
that emerged. Yeah.
No, I think you've hit upon some really key deficiencies, things that we need to both think more about conceptually, theoretically, and also modeling decisions. And I knew that this was going to happen coming in today because I had questions about these for you guys, and I'm glad that you picked up on them. I'm not surprised. And I just want to thank you for spending your Wednesday morning with me, for taking the time to read the paper and think hard thoughts about it. I'm grateful. And I hope to have the opportunity to return the favor somewhere down the line to pay it forward. So thank you guys very much.
Great. And I want to mention, I'm probably going to slaughter your co-author's name, Juan Ugarriza, who hopefully has been watching, but he's also involved in this project, so we want to recognize him as well.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you all. Appreciate, Christian, I appreciate you doing this. Please let people know we've created this for junior people who are not yet tenured, PhD students. Thank you to everybody for being a discussant. Please keep an eye out for the call for papers.
Thanks a million again, guys. Hope to see you soon and meet you in person.
All righty, folks. Be well.
Ciao. Bye.
Bye.